Yes.
Okay. Look okay here?
Yes, perfect. So I'm going.
Great.
All right. So everyone's here now. I'm going to pass it off to Alex and Rick.
All right. I'll let you take it from here, Alex, and I'll be moderating the questions and interacting on the chat.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rick, and thanks everybody for having me. Excited to talk to you all today about why Bitcoin's decentralized financial system is important for human rights. I wanted to start with a story, a fiction story that many of you are familiar with, that George Orwell wrote many, many decades ago. And one of the key themes from 1984 was that Big Brother is watching you. And this epic quote that nothing is your own except the few cubic centimeters inside your skull. This has always been the dream of dictators and authoritarians around the world. And in the last few decades, it's actually been made possible with advanced technology. Because people in power have realized that if they can get you to trade off your privacy and your freedom for convenience, speed, and comfort, then they can build a big brother that knows more and more about you and that siphons and sucks up all of your personal information and makes it easier for them to control and socially engineer society. The largest experiment of this sort is being done in China. And in China, obviously, as many of you know, WeChat is a dominant platform, operating system that does almost anything for you. This young woman here talks about how she uses WeChat to message friends in the middle of rural areas and to pay for snacks in remote villages, buy train tickets, to check the weather, to pay bills, handle health stuff. It all sounds so great to do everything on one app, but you have to realize what you're trading off in terms of your privacy and your freedom for this convenience. And this kind of phenomenon has led to what is known as social credit or citizen scores in China. Now, these are overblown, I think, in many ways, but the general idea is that the intention that the Chinese Communist Party has is not overblown. They do want, ultimately, in the next few years, for everyone in China to have some sort of number that they are scored on. And this is because they'd rather rule by self-censorship than with an iron fist. They'd rather you control yourself than them have to control you. So instead of like a credit score that we might have here in the United States or in Europe, where you're judged by your credit worthiness and financial health, they actually look at your behavior and micro habits, your demographics, your religion, your ethnicity, for example, your social networks, your state loyalty. And so you're really being judged as a patriot, not just as someone who's using a financial system. And that's kind of where this particular model is heading. And we're seeing some new social engineering experience being made possible with this. I mean, one of them is called debt shaming. So for example, you might be walking around and looking down at your phone, and you might see somebody on a map in front of you, and that person may be presented to you as being problematic because of their score. Maybe they're a poet, maybe they are a sexual minority, an ethnic minority, who knows? But you're going to stay away from them. Also, when you try to call someone or text somebody, in certain areas in China, you're like warned if someone is problematic. So people are trying to create, rather the Communist Party is trying to create pariahs out of troublemakers. And I think that's a really dangerous direction for society to go down. This social engineering, which is reliant upon increasing big data and AI siphoning up and understanding you and what you do, is being paired with advanced, developments in surveillance technology. So, for example,
Cool.
This woman is a police.
I have two laptops. I'm like,
she is
one kitchen and another.
She's looking out, and she's basically part of this network that China's building, where they're going to have more than 500 million surveillance cameras by 2021. So that's one for every 2 to 3 people. And when she sees, the crowd in front of her through her Google Glass type devices, is she's really looking at something like this, where, the Chinese government is able to get like a quick download of everybody's information and also all the vehicles and where they're going. So the idea is for them to have omniscience. The idea is for them to actually achieve that big brother vision that Orwell once laid out, and to really make it so that even the thoughts in your head are barely your own because you're self-censoring. And they're combining this with what's happening today with regard to coronavirus. So they're kind of expanding this, I would say, this intrusion on you and your personality through biometrics and health, in terms of trying to assign you a color in order for you to be able to go about your daily life. So these colors are not necessarily connected to your wearables or your what's inside your body. Someone else is determining what color you are. And if you're not green in some cities, like in Hubei province, Wuhan, etc., you don't get to leave your apartment, your home. You can't go to work. You can't go to public transportation. So this, I would say it's unlikely that this is a temporary measure. The chairman of the Human Rights Foundation, Garry Kasparov, has an old Soviet joke saying, nothing is more permanent than temporary measures. So I would expect this to be kind of part of the fabric of life moving forward. And it's something I don't think free societies are compatible with. And I think young people in China are obviously struggling with this. A lot of them are wondering if this is a futurist society, utopia, or a dystopia, or a cage. And that's a fair conversation. The Chinese Communist Party says that they're pushing people in the direction of a harmonious society. And, I think that's a giant euphemism, to be honest with you, because what this leads to is microcontrol over the population. And what does a harmonious society actually look like? It looks very ugly. This is one of the excesses, the outgrowths, the results of a harmonious society. This is a prison camp in Xinjiang, in the northwest part of China, where this particular facility is one of many, many facilities that have more than 1 million, usually male Uyghurs, which is a Muslim minority, in them. So according to the UN, anywhere from 1 to 2 million Uyghurs are in these prison camps. And to give you an idea of the scale of that, during World War II, the Nazis in 1942 at their peak held about 715,000 detainees in their camps. Right now, obviously, the CCP has more than 1 million Muslims in their camps. So while the camps might be different, this gives you an idea of what we're dealing with here in terms of social engineering, and again, all made possible by advanced technology. This isn't just a concern for people who live within China's borders. All the countries in red are countries where their governments are buying Chinese surveillance technology or telecommunications technology. This is from a study done by the New York Times a few months ago. So everywhere from Bolivia to Mexico to Germany to Pakistan to South Africa to Indonesia to Russia to the United Kingdom is involved here. So I think that this is very concerning for anyone, no matter where you live. Now, what do we do? How do we fight back? How do we present a different model? Well, the Sapiens author, Yuval Noah Harari, has said that if you dislike the idea of living in a digital dictatorship, which obviously, in my view, is what the CCP is building, then the most important contribution you can make is to find ways to prevent too much data from being concentrated in too few hands. They won't be easy tasks, but achieving them may be the best safeguard of democracy. And I believe this is very important, especially for finance, especially for money and transactions, because today cash is disappearing. As of about a year ago, these are the numbers, these are the percentages of cash in terms of daily transactions in these societies. So Great Britain, only 42% of transactions are paper. In America, 32%, Sweden, 20%, South Korea, 14%. Since these numbers came out, they're obviously lower today. They continue to get lower. And in some places like Beijing or Caracas or Stockholm, the cashless world is pretty much already here. So we're going all digital with our money. And there's even a war on cash, I think, that you need to start looking out for. So according to the World Health Organization, they were going back and forth about this, but at one point they were saying, dirty banknotes might be spreading the coronavirus. Well, they weren't stopping the postal service. They were targeting cash for a particular reason, and I think you're going to see these demonetization efforts increase in the future. And I think we have to think very carefully about what the implications are of a cashless society where all money is digitally centralized. Cash gives us certain powers. Cash gives us sovereignty. It's a bearer asset. And if we are to resign those powers, we should be very careful about what we're giving up. For example, what happens when we lose financial privacy? Now, think about the rights that are taken away. What happens? What powers do states and corporations gain? And when you think about what happens when you go and actually buy something, when you buy or sell something, it's saying more about you than your words. So I'd like you to think about the last time you bought something with cash, right? So when you buy something with cash, you don't reveal anything about yourself, right? The merchant doesn't know your name. You don't have to disclose anything. Typically, you just go in, you hand them a piece of paper or some coins, you walk out. This preserves your privacy, freedom. It allows you to, have, privacy and civil liberties, and it reduces the growth of Big Brother. Like if we're all doing this, Big Brother can't exist because Big Brother needs data to feed and survive and grow. But when you're using centralized digital financial services, swiping, using credit cards, touchless, you're feeding Big Brother. You're giving Big Brother your location, your daily timings, your micro habits, your travel history, your whereabouts, your biometrics, all kinds of stuff, depending on what you're doing. And I think the big question for us, obviously, today is, and the theme of my presentation is, could we have a different kind of cashless society? Could we have a decentralized financial system without third parties and controlling authorities? Is this possible? And I think it's really interesting to look at the evolution of money. And if you think about how money has gone from barter to shells and precious gems to coins made of gold and silver to coins made of gold and silver with kings' faces stamped on them to paper money indicating ownership of things like gold to cards and mobile payments, we're about to enter the next era of money and finance, and that's wearables and chips under your skin. These are coming, and I think that road is a dangerous road. I mean, that road is a road that ends with an erosion of civil liberties over time and eventually an unrecognizable society. Miraculously, a little over a decade ago, someone came up with a different way of doing things. Someone came up with Bitcoin. And I really wanted to focus on a couple different aspects of Bitcoin that I appreciate. I think Bitcoin is different things to different people. But for me, this idea that it's this decentralized peer-to-peer system is so important, because if you think about the way that any other financial system works, when you pay, there's intermediaries in the middle: PayPal, Visa, WeChat, Venmo, MasterCard, etc. And all of those intermediaries can surveil, censor, track what you're doing, confiscate your funds. With Bitcoin, it's just you and the other person. This is a peer-to-peer transaction. The processing is decentralized in a global competition. And I think this is quite revolutionary, so much so that I would posit to you that in the same way that I think democracy was a tool that humans used to decentralize political power from tyranny to representative democracy, and how internet was a tool that humans used to decentralize the means of production and distribution of information, which used to be only for the elite, and now everybody can access information or have a voice. Bitcoin does that for money. I believe that Bitcoin will decentralize the means of production and distribution and open access to money. And when we talk about Bitcoin, I think we got to think about scarcity. Bitcoin's the first decentralized digital scarce asset. There are other decentralized things in the world, many things like BitTorrent, for example. The internet is largely decentralized. There are obviously many, many digital things, but scarcity online is something that didn't really exist before Bitcoin. And I think that scarcity for money is so, so important. The reason why gold is still so valuable today, even though it's just a rock in the ground, is because it is scarce. If you think about how in 350 BC Babylon, 1 ounce of gold got you 350 loaves of bread. Today in 2019 AD San Francisco, 1 ounce of gold still gets you 350 loaves of bread. So gold has a remarkable store of value because it doesn't increase in terms of new gold into the system very much every year. So Satoshi, when he created Bitcoin, he or she really wanted to, I think, make that possible in the digital realm. And you can see this in a way when you look at the Genesis block and you see his or her commentary on the bailout of banks. And what's important to note here is that they are criticizing a system whereby the money can be infinite, where it's not limited. And if you think about what's happening right now in the news, what you're seeing is essentially the Cantillon Effect, which was named after Richard Cantillon, a 18th century economist. And he pointed out that when the state prints money, the closer you are to power, the more you benefit. The further away you are, the more you're harmed. So in a centralized financial system, the people who print the money benefit more than you do. So fiat money is not neutral. The people who print it get to benefit. So you have to think about who gets bailed out first when you look at the news today. Is it the little person or the big corporations? Obviously the big corporations. So while I don't think Bitcoin's going to solve things like inequality or corruption, I think that's extreme. What I do think it does is it presents a new financial system where nobody, gets to enjoy favoritism at the spigot of money. Everybody's equal in the eyes of Bitcoin from that perspective. If you're wealthy, yes, you can get more Bitcoin than someone else, but no one can be blocked out of the system. And it's really like, I guess, digital equality of opportunity. So when it comes to the four kind of features of Bitcoin I want you to take away. Number one, predictable money supply. This is so, so important. Bitcoin, again, was created as an alternative to central banks. So, that arbitrarily determined money issuance. This power is often abused by the elite at the expense of the rest. In Bitcoin, the money supply schedule and future inflation rates, which you can see here, are public and known to all. Inflation, we all know, will end, and the last piece of Bitcoin is minted in 2136. The second key attribute is permissionlessness. Anyone can use Bitcoin without asking permission from a government or a company. You don't need a bank account or a state ID to earn and receive Bitcoin. This is so powerful given that billions of people live under tyranny or don't have the proper credentials to access the existing financial system. Censorship resistance is number 3. If you want to send me Bitcoin, no one can censor that transaction. Payment processing is done through a global competition, not by an entity. It doesn't matter if you have the control of a bunch of miners in China, they can't censor my transaction. As a result, if I'm a media outlet, civil society organization, human rights group, you're a dictatorship or a repressive government, you can no longer prevent me from receiving donations. One of the reasons I'm interested in Bitcoin. And then finally, confiscation resistance. If you want to move your Bitcoin, then you need to use a private key. That private key could be a series, as you know, of 24 words that can be written down, split apart, disguised, or even memorized. This makes Bitcoin obviously much harder for authorities to locate and confiscate than any other asset, whether it be cash, gold, or anything that is custodied with a third party. So for all those reasons, when I look at the future of money and I look at the future of fiat money, of state money, and I look at the future of corporate money, something like Libra controlled by corporations, or many of the cryptocurrency projects now are controlled by corporations, I think of Bitcoin as the people's money. It's not controlled by anybody. Nobody's in charge. And that to me is incredibly powerful. Thing is, less than 1% of us have used Bitcoin. There's, according to the Human Rights Foundation, about 52% of the world, 4.2 billion people live under an authoritarian regime. And yet less than 70 million people out of the 7.5 billion on our planet have, from what we understand, used Bitcoin. But the opportunities, again, are huge. I mean, 2 billion people aren't banked or don't have an ID. Well, nothing can prevent them outside of having internet access from setting up a wallet and receiving or earning Bitcoin. And again, 4 billion people, a little more than 4 billion people live under authoritarianism. So they're dealing with intense financial repression and controls. Along those lines, if you think about it with Bitcoin, this whole system I described to you earlier of what Xi Jinping is doing in China can't do that with Bitcoin. Much more difficult to micro-track people in a pseudonymous system where there are privacy tools. Mr. Putin loves to freeze the bank accounts of human rights organizations. Well, you can't do that with Bitcoin. Can't stop them from receiving Bitcoin. The Burmese junta likes to basically delete the identities of religious minorities in Burma. Well, can't do that if they're trying to access Bitcoin. The US government likes to sanction particular countries, which I believe is unfair, given that usually those countries are dictatorships where the people aren't even voting for what their dictatorships are doing. Iran is a good example. Like the average 23-year-old person in Iran didn't vote for her government, so why should she be punished by us? Well, she can now earn in Bitcoin. And in Venezuela and in Zimbabwe and in Somaliland and many other places, we've seen this devastating impact of hyperinflation. And that is something that Bitcoin gives you an escape from. So for example, this is what was happening in Venezuela. In 2016, a cup of coffee cost 450 bolivars. 2017, it cost 4,500. 2018, it cost 1.4 million. So if you think about this, this is like the vaporization of savings of lower and middle class people. Bitcoin has given some Venezuelans who've learned about it and have engaged with it a way to store their value in a way that can help them preserve their time and energy for the future and also help them escape. I think this is a good image of the paradigm shift that we see where the Venezuelan government tried to blockade highways to prevent opposition from sending in aid and resources, which is, I think, on the dustbin of history. Like they could do this now, but what you don't see are the millions of Bitcoin going back and forth. So the government, the state is no longer going to be able to stop money flows. And this is going to have a huge impact on the world. A lot of people, of course, criticize Bitcoin, and we can get into that later. But I thought this particular criticism was funny from a guy named Buttcoin, who says there isn't a single goddamn thing that Bitcoin can do for retail that Apple Pay doesn't already do 10 times better. And then my friend Zia, who's living in Iran, says, I can't use Apple Pay or anything like it. I'm from Iran, but I do use Bitcoin. What do you have to say to that? So Buttcoin did not have a response. And in general, I think that from a civil liberties perspective, Nassim Nicholas Taleb has said it well, the Black Swan author, that Bitcoin's mere existence gives us the crowd an insurance policy against an Orwellian future. And to unpack that, here is a photograph from Hong Kong that my friend Mary, a journalist for Quartz, took last summer, where Hong Kongers typically, when they go in the metro, they use an Oyster card that is often attached to their ID. Well, they knew that they didn't want their authorities or their school supervisors to know that they were using the metro system to get off at protest points. So they all lined up, a lot of them with masks, to buy one-time use or sort of top-up cards with cash, so that their transit, their movement would not be linked to their identity. So this is a clear demonstration of why financial privacy matters for freedom, democracy, and our ability to hold our governments accountable, especially in urban areas. So again, cash is disappearing. Hong Kongers won't have cash in 20 years. So how are they going to hold their government accountable? I think Bitcoin will play a key role in that. If Bitcoin fails, I think the WeChat model will win. I think all governments kind of converge on this centralized kind of data vacuum model. And why wouldn't they? Who would blame them? But if Bitcoin survives and thrives, then look, humans have money that can not be censored by authorities, cannot be devalued by governments, cannot be monopolized by corporations, cannot be easily mass surveilled, cannot be stopped by borders, can be accessed by anybody. And that's so incredibly powerful. I think we're looking at the new space race for the 21st century is the one of global monetary dominance. You've seen how essentially the United States is currently totally in control of that at the moment, with almost all transactions in the world being denominated in dollars. But the Chinese are making a big play with their DCEP digital currency plans and their Belt and Road campaign to build infrastructure around the world. And the Russians and many other governments are interested in this as well. And at the end of the day, any of those governments, if they win, we're going to have a world that has a lot of features that look a lot like that WeChat model that we described. But at the end of the day, Bitcoin's out there too. Bitcoin's in the mix. And that gives me great hope that we can have a world financial system that has equality of opportunity, that can't be exploited, and that people can't use, again, favoritism to dole out the money, that basically everybody would be equal in the eyes of what is the law. So it gives me a little bit of optimism despite the darkness of the talk. And I just like to leave you with this quote from Buckminster Fuller: "You never change things by fighting against the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old model obsolete." So with Bitcoin, we're not exactly trying to edit the financial system or build something that makes a digital dollar or whatever. No, we're like really trying to create something that's entirely new and obsoletes the old model completely. And I think Buckminster Fuller would really enjoy seeing Bitcoin if he were still around today. Well, that's it. Thanks very much, everybody.
Great. That was fantastic. Thanks so
Rick.
much. Yeah, we've got a bunch of questions that have been coming in. So I'd love to just throw them to you and see how you take them. I think one of the common themes from Adele and a couple of others is, currently, obviously, Bitcoin's extremely traceable and trackable, and it's pseudonymous, but everything's public. And there are kind of companies that work very hard to kind of de-anonymize different Bitcoin addresses. And I'm just curious, like, what are the things that make you optimistic that we can get to a stage where Bitcoin and other technologies like it will be both kind of auditable and private? I'm curious to hear your takes on that and thoughts on that long term.
Obviously, privacy is so important to me. I think it's one of the most critical things. I think without, if Bitcoin doesn't have privacy, there's no such thing as perfect privacy. But if it doesn't have pretty good privacy in the future, then it won't really be worth using. I think it will have failed. That being said, monetary policy to me is paramount. It's the most important thing, that everybody can audit the amount of Bitcoin that exists. So to me, the most important thing is that everybody can run a full node at home on a relatively cheap device to audit the amount of Bitcoin that exists. Unfortunately, this poses problems with very advanced experimental privacy technology, which is why we can't have things like confidential transactions on main chain Bitcoin right now. However, I believe that in the future, you will see that. The advances in privacy in Bitcoin are pretty amazing. I mean, just the other day, you could start donating to the Human Rights Foundation, for example, using PayJoin, which helps over time, hopefully break the common ownership input heuristic. So there are lots of cool tricks and different things that people are coming up with now to help mask what's happening on the blockchain. And personally, I think a lot of what's happening with chain analysis companies is witchcraft. I think a lot of it is assumptions that can be broken over time with new things that Bitcoiners have figured out how to do. And I think privacy will get there over time. I really do. And, on the second layer, that opens up a whole new level of privacy if you want to make certain trade-offs. So if you want to make trade-offs with security, you can go Lightning. If you want to make trade-offs with a third party, you can go Liquid, things like that. At the end of the day, privacy is critical to me. And I think if Bitcoin doesn't have pretty good privacy, it will have failed. But I do believe that it's coming. And I do believe there'll be a little war inside Bitcoin over this concept. I believe a lot of Bitcoiners don't care about privacy, and they will fight privacy upgrades, privacy additions. So I think this is going to be a big source of conflict in the next couple of years in Bitcoin. People who care about privacy versus people who just want to see number go up.
Absolutely. And I was just curious if you had kind of some take on China's economic influence. I mean, we're seeing certain institutions really crumble in an environment where China's influence is taking hold, and how does coronavirus kind of expose some of those underlying mechanics that you might be very well aware of, but regular people are just kind of wising up to?
Yeah, look, a lot of what the Chinese Communist Party reports is there's a lot of smoke and mirrors. I mean, obviously, largest country in the world, massive manufacturing base. But at the end of the day, no one really trusts the RMB. I mean, about 2% of anywhere from 2 to 4%, depending on what numbers you look at, of all global transactions are denominated in RMB. Foreign exchange reserves, less than 2% are held in RMB. I mean, almost 80 to 90% are held in dollars and euros. So right now, the world doesn't really trust the RMB. So that's a big challenge for China. So I think what they're basically trying to do is get around the trust thing through their Belt and Road campaign, which is the largest infrastructure project in human history. It's like way bigger than the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Europe after World War II. And this is a way for them to come in and offer cheap loans and basically build infrastructure for countries like Pakistan, Zambia, et cetera. And then kind of like introduce their technology. And I believe this is a play to where they'll eventually introduce their currency. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm actually pretty bearish on China's prospects to dominate the world economically, or at least more than I used to be. I think the coronavirus has devastated China's economy a lot more than they're letting on. I mean, they're letting on historic devastation, but from what I understand from people I've talked to, it's worse than that. So we could see it from satellite imagery. We could see the pollution go away. We could see things stop, right? So I do think that China's like play to be economically dominant will go on hold. I think the dollar is just so strong right now, and I think will continue to be so in the near future, even despite all the money printer go burr. So we'll have to see, but I wouldn't want to give them a chance. Like, I think it's very important that the CCP does not have that economic dominance for the reasons I laid out here, because they're putting millions of Muslims in prison camps. So let's like try to fight that in different ways. Some people may want to try to do that through the US government. I would prefer to do that through open source, decentralized, scarce money.
And I like this question here. Is the Human Rights Foundation kind of directly educating people about Bitcoin? And if so, how? And what methods are you doing through your work at the HRF to sort of expand access?
Yeah, so look, the Human Rights Foundation focuses on civil liberties and basic human freedoms in authoritarian regimes around the world. And there are many: the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the freedom to participate in your government, the freedom to believe what you want to believe. Obviously, property rights is a very important civil liberty, right? And so is free speech. So to me, Bitcoin is kind of the combination of the two. If you have free speech and you have property rights, you should be able to have Bitcoin, or at least the law should permit that. And I think what's interesting for me is that the Human Rights Foundation is just trying to do some research, just trying to find out from people who live in authoritarian societies, what's the situation with money? I mean, we're learning some amazing stuff. I mean, how many of you knew that in Eritrea, which is probably a lot of you don't even know what that is. I honestly, I didn't at one point either, but now I know many Eritreans who are fighting an epic battle peacefully because their government is like the North Korea of Africa. And this country on the Horn of Africa, about 10 years ago, just scrapped all of the currency. So people had saved up all this money. It's about the same time that North Korea did the same thing. So people had saved up in cash, and the government just said, oh, no, we're going to introduce a new one. This got people really angry. So when you talk to Eritreans about, hey, here's money that the government doesn't control, they get very excited. So I think that like when you actually go out there and you talk to people who live under repressive governments, they're very interested in Bitcoin. It's just a matter of time. So I think, what I tried to do personally is write the little Bitcoin book, and we're getting it translated into a bunch of languages. And I hope that can help folks. But I see Bitcoin as one of, like, alongside other things like advocacy for free expression and journalism is so important. And, privacy, browsing the internet online using Tor browser, using Signal. I see it as part of like a big package of privacy and sovereignty that I guess we hope to deploy and share with activists around the world.
And there's a few questions here about some of the stable coins and dollar-backed assets. Are any of the efforts to create something that mimics the dollar to kind of help people stay relatively stable in their assets, but also transfer across a crypto network in an uncensorable way? Are any of those appealing or interesting at all? Or do you feel it's not something that's worth pursuing, and having kind of a single monetary base is the best way to go?
Look, I think that obviously some people are using stable coins. People use Tether to get money back and forth from China to Russia. I've seen people in Argentina using theyre. But ultimately, look, it's pegged to the dollar. So I think in the short term, stable coins are kind of interesting in some ways. maybe for commerce or for moving money. But ultimately, you have to remember Bitcoin is trying to obsolete the dollar. Bitcoin is trying to present a totally different financial system. So this is not they're not really competing in any way. I mean, Bitcoin is just in a different ballpark than stablecoins. Stablecoins are trying to upgrade the legacy financial system, whereas Bitcoin is trying to create a new financial system. That's the best way I can put it. So long term, especially for people living under dictatorships, I think long term Bitcoin is going to be the thing they are interested in, because it is a entirely new system, bereft from any connection to the old.
Brilliant. Well, Alex, thanks so much for your time. We've got to pop on to the next presentation, and really those slides are beautiful. I'm sure we can maybe post a link to them.
Yeah, if anyone wants to know the designer, they can ping me on Twitter at Gladstein. Thanks, guys, so much for having me on. It was a blast.
Yeah, brilliant. Cheers. Thanks so much.
Take care.